Sunday reflecting on this month's topic of vocation. And I'm pleased to share the speaking today with somebody who's in a different vocation than mine. Dr. Aroop Mangalik is a member of First Unitarian, and he's an oncologist and an ethicist. He retired from clinical practice in 2013, and now he teaches at UNM's medical and law schools. He's also the author of a book called Dealing with Doctors, Denial, and Death. Some of you might have attended one of our adult religious exploration sessions in which he shared wisdom accumulated from his 5 decades of clinical practice, as well as personal experience and wisdom about the way doctors are trained to deal with the inevitability of death. So our message today is not the usual sermon format, but more of a conversation between a minister and a physician. It's a conversation about a topic that affects all of us, death, which is, of course, both a health or medical and a spiritual experience that we have in our lives. Aroop, will you tell us a little bit more about you and about the training physicians receive about death?
Yes. I graduated from medical school in 1958 and completed my training in hematology and oncology by 1966. I was involved with the training and taking care of patients with serious and even fatal diseases for 50 years. In my early years, I focused on the treatment of the disease. In retrospect, I feel that I paid less attention to the whole patient and the whole person, and I was fairly heavily involved with clinical trials and experimental treatments. I cannot give a specific time that I changed my emphasis, but gradually I became more concerned about the person as a whole rather than just the treatment of the disease. One reason that the emphasis that I had and many people have about the treatment of the disease is because of our training. In medical school, we are trained that medical students should not fail. The training is on all levels of emphasis, is in pathology, physiology, and pharmacology, etc. And of course, that is necessary. But doctors are also told that they should not fail. Now, failing in an exam is one thing, but failing has many connotations. And the failure is often also used by doctors to say that if they have failed in relation to treatment of the patient. Of course, we want to help the patient to feel better and control or cure their ails. If the treatment the doctor recommends and uses does not achieve its goals, that is not failure. Of course, we must check that we gave the right kind of treatment. It is the nature of the disease very often, most often, which is the reason why the treatment failed, and we have to keep that in mind. This attitude about lacking failure translates into, if the treatment I gave did not achieve its goal, it was failure on my part. Doctors often try then other types of treatments just because the treatments are available, even if there is a small chance of benefit and the burden of the treatment is high. This is often what leads to poor quality of life and suffering before death. It is now more accepted that all treatments will not be effective and patients and people will die. I am glad to say that the UNM School of Medicine, we have started a new perspective on our teaching. And I'm happy to say that more recently I have noticed this approach is bearing results. I see more realistic approach to serious illnesses amongst the younger doctors. This is allowing the patients to receive treatment when it is needed, but more importantly, it is to receive care when it is appropriate. It is accepted more and more that there are limits to medical science, and there is value to changing from treatment to care of the whole patient.
So there's some movement from avoiding death entirely to accepting that it might be an inevitable outcome in some cases and not a failure.
Yes.
This is something that impacts all of us throughout all of our lives because eventually we must deal not only with our own deaths, but with the deaths of loved ones also.
Yes, I'd like to return that question back to you, Angela. How are the Unitarian Universalist ministers trained to think about death? Is there a spiritual tendency to avoid this subject also?
Well, the short answer is we ministers spend quite a bit of time studying and thinking about death. And it's also true that there can sometimes be a tendency, and maybe it's just a human tendency, to avoid the issue. In seminary, one of the most formative classes I took was one called Buddhist Approaches to Death and Dying. In that class, I met Roshi Joan Halifax, and she's the founder of Upaya Zen Center up in Santa Fe. She flew back east to lead my graduate school class in a workshop about being present with death. First, we had to come to terms with our own mortality. So Roshi Joan led us in some meditations where we visualized our bodies moving through the life cycle, from birth and growth, all the way to picturing our bodies wearing out and beginning to shut down. Who did we imagine would be there? What did we imagine it would look or feel like? And then she asked us to visualize the moment of death and our bodies after death. What would happen to our bodies? At what point would they cease to look like bodies and be returned in some form to the earth? It was a very graphic meditation.
Sounds like that.
Yes. At first, it was really unsettling to do this, but then this feeling of peace just washed over me, and I saw really clearly that every negative or stressful experience is as impermanent as life itself. This is what the Buddhists mean when they talk about making friends with death. By overcoming our avoidance to these thoughts, we began letting go of our anxiety. And we let the reality of death be present to us right now. And therefore, we were able to become more present with others who were dying. Because often it's fear of our own mortality that scares us away from being present to dying in others. In my chaplaincy internship at an urban hospital, I saw many deaths. Some were really difficult, some were really beautiful and peaceful. Those tended to involve medical care geared toward comfort rather than prolonging life when death was already near. One conundrum ministers sometimes face is when a person asks us to pray for them to be cured, and we know that's very unlikely to happen. We 100% want to join them in that prayer. It's our prayer too. And at the same time, we want to support them in being spiritually prepared for death if a cure is not to be. So we have to find a way to hold both of those things together in a pastoral visit. In my experience, Unitarian Universalists tend to be pretty open to those kinds of conversations. But UUs, like everybody else, could do better at speaking about death before the end of life is near. In a recent issue of our denomination's magazine, UU World, there's a story about a minister and her grandfather. They had spoken openly about the eventuality of his death for years, and she'd told him how much she would miss him. He had shared that he felt he had lived a really good life, and he was ready whenever the time should come. They had this conversation off and on again for about 15 years. And then one night, when he was 96 years old, she went in to check on him, and she observed that he was having some kind of cardiac episode. When she called her parents to come in and be with him, one of them said, "I'll call 911." But she asked them to hold on a second and just reconsider. She explained that once medical intervention began, it would be very, very hard to stop it. And that resuscitating a 96-year-old man's heart was not likely to lead to lasting quality of life afterward. He had expressed that he was ready. Maybe they should allow the process to unfold naturally, she said, as long as he was not suffering. So they did, and hours later, he died peacefully. Most of us don't have that kind of clarity with our loved ones, and we may not even be sure what the law says about such things. Aroop, a moment ago, you mentioned the idea of treatment versus care. How do you see the difference between those two things?
There is no sharp distinction between treatment and care, But treatment attempts to control the disease, like a broken bone or to improve the function of a failing heart. Care, of course, must be given along with the disease, treatment of the disease. But once after due deliberation and discussion, it is decided that the disease cannot be controlled, the emphasis changes to relieving the symptoms and to reducing the burdens that the patient has and to care of the whole person.
And in certain cases, when death is definitely near, there's another option called aid in dying. Tell us about that.
Yes, if the burdens of living cannot be relieved by the best efforts of the providers and the patient, and when the patient is expected to die in the near future, there is another option that is available, at least in some states. The option is of hastening their death. This patient can voluntarily stop eating or drinking, and that will hasten the process of death. And people who have used this method have noted that they did not suffer hunger or thirst because the body was shutting down anyway. Then also there is the option of aid in dying. If the patient chooses that option, the medical provider can write a prescription to the patient, which will be self-administered. Remember, the patient is the one who makes the choice.
So with aid in dying, the doctor can provide a prescription for a lethal amount of a drug, but they don't actually deliver the drug to the patient
That is
themselves.
correct.
So it's up to the patient to decide when and if they ever use it. And I know there's quite a big process around it. Not just anybody can get such a prescription. Aid in dying is something many states and some other countries have considered. When I lived in Oregon in the 1990s, we were referring to it as assisted suicide back then. Opponents called it euthanasia. So why do you say aid in dying instead of assisted suicide or euthanasia?
I think the better term is aid in dying because it is not suicide. The death was going to be coming to the patient in the very near future. It is not euthanasia because the doctor is only writing a prescription. The patient takes the prescription at their time of choosing, and they may or may not take the drug. And therefore, it is not euthanasia and it is not suicide.
I know one concern about medical aid in dying is that if doctors are allowed to write those kinds of prescriptions, maybe it'll happen in the wrong circumstances, or people will make that decision based on the high cost of medical care instead of their true personal choice. And I agree that we cannot let those things happen. But most Americans, studies have shown, do support the idea that when a person's condition is not curable and they face a painful death in the near future, and they would like the option of a prescription to end their life when they're ready, that it's most compassionate for society to include a carefully considered option for honoring that request, rather than always just flatly declaring it illegal. And in fact, I've noticed that sometimes people find ways to make this choice without their doctor's assistance. I have at times led memorial services where, when I was interviewing the family, I get the feeling that the person might have done this, might have hastened their own death. But the family is not sure if they can tell me the truth, and I'm not sure if I can ask them, because if they helped their loved one in any way, then asking them about it might also mean asking them to reveal that they have broken the current law.
Yes, I have also heard of many of my patients telling me openly that I will take the pain medication that you have, and I will hoard them, and I will take them all at one time. And this has been done, by second hand, I have found that this has happened. But this is not unfortunate. This is not a good thing to do, because the unfortunate reality is that patients may survive such an attempt because they do not understand many of the ramifications of such an attempted overdose, and the suffering is therefore magnified. Further, to protect their family and friends, they go through this process alone, and they are lonely. There is another one more on the method of hastening a patient's death. It is a method used by some physicians, and it is, if the patient is very sick, and suffering from severe pain, you can put the patient in what is called terminal sedation. In terminal sedation, the doctor gives the patient large doses of sedatives and painkillers by an intravenous infusion. The patient's pain may be relieved, but they are helpless. They cannot interact with their family, and they are vulnerable to pneumonia and bed sores. After days, sometimes a week or two, they die. The family just sits there and watches hopelessly. Some believe that because of the intent in terminal sedation is to relieve pain, and the intent was not to have the patient end his life, it is morally justified. I disagree.
It seems to me that it would honor life more if we could have these conversations and consider all of the options before we're in a place of defaulting or feeling helpless. And it would honor families if they could share openly without fear of repercussions about that. Honoring life and honoring families is why talking about medical aid in dying is a vocational issue for me as a minister. Death is part of life. It's an important and deeply spiritual event in a human life and in a family. Our denomination, the Unitarian Universalist Association, supports aid in dying and has for many years. They passed a resolution about that in 1988 at the denomination's General Assembly. Unitarian Universalism does not regard it as a sin in any way. Rather, the belief is that because life is a precious gift and death is a natural part of a human life, it's not right that anybody should be forced to prolong life at its natural end with unnecessary suffering and medical interventions. The United Church of Christ and the United Methodist Church are two other denominations that have expressed support. And in addition, individual religious leaders from a broad array of traditions have also affirmed that in certain cases, aid in dying can be an ethical choice. Desmond Tutu is one example.
Acceptance of death is not easy. Of course, we all know it's going to happen, but somehow we have a disconnect. As a doctor, I need to work with living patients, some healthy and others with medical and health problems. It is common that I deal with the transition from the living to the dead. My aim and hope is to make the transition as comfortable as possible, both physically and spiritually. I have unfortunately seen many times when this does not happen. Mostly it is because the doctor, the patient, or both are unwilling and unable to accept that death is near. I would like to briefly describe at this point my father's death, which was many years ago. He had been in excellent health and developed shortness of breath and died within 6 months after his first symptoms appeared. Through that period, we never talked about what was happening and what was going to happen. He died lonely, even though we were all in the room, but he died lonely emotionally and spiritually. It is this acceptance of death that I have become aware of and try to help my patients, making the transition easier. It is often said that aid in dying goes against the Hippocratic Oath. The line that is used in this context is, do no harm. That is one of the tenets of the Hippocratic Oath. This is a very broad generalization, and I agree with the generalization, yes, do no harm. But my point is that pain and suffering are also a harm. And therefore, I feel that aid in dying, which reduces the duration and intensity of the suffering, it does not go against the Hippocratic Oath.
What have you noticed about the role of spirituality in your patients' thinking?
The prevailing practice in medicine has been not to discuss the spirituality or religious beliefs of the patient. I do not know what its origin is, but that's the way it has been. Only patients, if the patient brings it up, then we talk about the religion, and basically we just say, whatever you believe, we'll accept. But no further discussion was held. More recently, by some studies, it has been found that if we acknowledge the patient's spirituality or religion, that helps the patient accept the reality of a serious illness. and it makes the situation much easier. Angela, what have you noticed about the role of doctors in patients' thinking?
Well, I've noticed that sometimes patients seem to need support in breaking the news that they're dying to their doctors. In other words, it's hard to start a conversation about deeply considering the personal costs, like emotional and physical costs of treatment versus the benefits. But the best medical care happens when there's an honest and trusting relationship between a doctor and their patient. What's the current state of aid in dying laws in New Mexico and in the US?
Aid in dying is legal in 8 states in the country, and of course it is legal in some states, in some countries in Europe. In New Mexico, the judicial system was petitioned to make the process legal. It was supported by a lower court, but the state Supreme Court ruled that it was a purview of the legislature and not of the courts. In 2017, it was debated in the New Mexico House and Senate, but narrowly lost. The bill was called, this year, a bill called End-of-Life Options will be presented to the both houses of the New Mexico legislature. There is broad support for this option, but the passage is certainly not cleared. Support comes from both Republicans and Democrats, and we have sponsors in both chambers. We are seeking more support for end-of-life option bill by informing people about the different demographics, people of different demographics, professions, and religious groups about what end-of-life option is all about and what it is not. To repeat and clarify some points, a terminally ill patient makes a request for a doctor to achieve the prescription for aid in dying. The doctor verifies that the patient is an adult and is mentally competent. The doctor reviews the medical records to make sure that the patient has really a short life expectancy. A second doctor has to confirm the above information. After a waiting period of 2 to 3 weeks, the physician writes the prescription for a lethal dose of a drug. The patient has the option of taking or not taking the drug, which is self-administered. Data from Oregon, which Angela mentioned earlier, about patients who requested and availed the lethal dose under the law, there were no instances of misuse or suggestion of coercion. Many people asked for the prescription as a backup in case their pain could not be controlled.
So, Aroop, what do you most hope your fellow UUs will take away from this conversation this morning?
My hope is that many people were not aware of the aid in dying, and more importantly, they did not know the details of it. So my hope is that they have learned a potential new option for those who are dying. I hope those who had reservations or misinformation, that has been clarified. And I hope that you will talk to your family and friends. Ask them to let their senators and representatives know that the end-of-life bill benefits the dying and their families and harms no one.
An interesting thing about the issue of aid in dying is that liberal and conservative lawmakers and liberal and conservative regular people have been able to come together around it a lot. The city councils in Santa Fe and Albuquerque have both passed bipartisan resolutions this year in support of this upcoming bill. And if you'd like to explore that further, or if you want some help planning conversations with your loved ones about end-of-life care, one good place to start is a website called Compassion and Choices. It's compassionandchoices.org. And that's a nonprofit that's been providing resources and advocacy for over 30 years in the US, so there's lots of good info there. And of course, you can always talk with your ministers about these things also. Whatever our wishes or situation might be, the time near death is a part of life that can and should be an experience of care and support. By talking about it with love and thoughtfulness, may we make it so.
Body or spirit to sing our closing song, Let It Be a Dance. The words will